Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. These were the words of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum in Davos just days ago, a powerful warning about geopolitics in 2026. But here's the uncomfortable truth Carney didn't fully address. Canada didn't just fail to get a seat at the table. Canada put itself on the menu. And now the United States is ready to eat. Before we go any further, let me be clear about one thing. This isn't a story about good countries and bad countries. It's not about blaming ordinary Canadians, and it's not about cheering for or against the United States. This is a story about power, leverage, and what happens when a nation, any nation, builds its entire future on a single assumption that stops being true. Canada is the case study, but the lesson is global. In geopolitics, there's a simple rule. If you make yourself vulnerable, someone will exploit that vulnerability. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, fair or unfair. What matters is power, leverage, and survival. And Canada gave away all three. Picture this, the world's longest undefended border. Two nations so intertwined that $2.5 billion in trade crosses between them every single day. A friendship so strong, they call it special. For over 150 years, Canada and the United States were the model of peaceful cooperation. But in 2025, everything changed. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of how Canada made one catastrophic mistake, putting 76% of all its economic eggs in one basket, and how that mistake is now tearing the country apart from the inside. This is the story of how Donald Trump called Canada the 51st state, and why some Canadians are starting to wonder if he's right. This is the story of provinces like Quebec and Alberta looking at independence. And this is the story of a prime minister who failed his country at the worst possible moment. Here's something that makes this even more absurd. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, nearly 10 million square kilometers of land. Yet this massive country with a population of just 40 million, less than California, less than Tokyo, is experiencing one of the worst housing crises in the developed world. In Toronto and Vancouver, average home prices exceed $1 million. Young Canadians can't afford to buy homes or even rent. Even the government's own projections admit that doubling construction wouldn't solve the crisis. Prices would still soar past $1.4 million in Toronto by 2035. And here's the political game. Every Canadian politician knows the fastest path to victory is promising to fix housing. Election after election, new candidates make the same pledges their predecessors broke. Why? Because solving it would require confronting powerful interests, developers, property investors, immigration policies adding hundreds of thousands annually without corresponding supply. So politicians promise everything, deliver nothing, and the cycle repeats. But the failures don't stop at housing. Canada's push for a green economy has turned into a graveyard of broken promises and wasted billions. Take Quebec's Northvolt disaster. In 2023, Quebec announced a massive $7 billion electric vehicle battery plant deal with Swedish company Northvolt. Quebec invested $270 million directly, plus a $240 million loan. Ottawa committed billions more. Politicians promised thousands of jobs and declared this would put Quebec at the center of the green economy revolution. Then, Northvolt's parent company declared bankruptcy in March 2025. The project collapsed. Quebec lost its $270 million investment completely. The jobs never materialized. The factory was never built. No one has gone to prison, no one has been held accountable, or consider SA-Aclico, Quebec's attempt to digitize its automobile insurance services. What should have been straightforward turned into a billion-dollar catastrophe. The project was budgeted at $638 million over 10 years when it launched in 2017. By 2025, the Auditor General revealed it would cost at least $1.1 billion, nearly double. And the system doesn't even work properly. When it launched in 2023, it created chaos. 2 years later, persistent problems remain. The Auditor General called it a total failure. The bidding process was rigged, giving one company unfair advantages. And again, no one in prison, no real accountability, just hundreds of millions vanished into a broken system. This is the pattern. Grand promises, catastrophic execution, no consequences. For decades, Canada pursued closer economic ties with the United States. The 1989 Free Trade Agreement, then NAFTA in 1994, created massive prosperity. Trade exploded, jobs multiplied. Canadian businesses thrived, selling to 330 million American consumers. The auto industry became so integrated that a single car might cross the border 7 times during manufacturing. By 2024, Canada exported 76% of all its goods to the United States. This wasn't just trade statistics. This was a supply chain choke point, a single point of failure. 3/4 of everything Canada sells flowing through one gateway. But here's another decision that came back to haunt Canada: the gold reserves. Between 2015 and 2016, Canada sold off virtually all of its gold reserves, the last 95,017 ounces, leaving the country with essentially nothing. At the time, gold was trading around $175 per ounce, and Canada generated about $122 million from the sales. The government's reasoning was straightforward. Gold doesn't pay interest, it costs money to store, and foreign currency reserves like U.S. Treasury bonds were considered more liquid and practical. Canada peaked at 1,003 tons of gold back in 1965. If Canada still held that gold today, with prices over $4,000 per ounce, it would be worth more than $132 billion. Instead, Canada became the only G7 country with zero gold reserves. But here's what makes this decision truly catastrophic. While Canada was selling, the rest of the world was buying. China increased its gold reserves by over 300 tons in recent years. Russia added hundreds of tons before sanctions hit. India, Poland, Turkey, and even emerging economies were aggressively accumulating gold, not because they're stupid, but because they understood something Canada's leaders didn't. Gold is insurance. It's leverage. It's the one asset that holds value when everything else collapses. When currencies fail, when trade wars erupt, when geopolitical tensions explode, gold is power. So while Canada was dumping its gold for $122 million, pocket change, other nations were preparing for exactly the kind of crisis Canada now faces. Now, as the trade war with America intensifies and the Canadian dollar weakens, Canada has no gold reserves to fall back on. No tangible asset that holds value independent of any other country's currency or economic policies. Canada's reserves are entirely in paper currencies, over half in US dollars. Think about that irony. Canada is protecting itself from American economic pressure by holding American dollars. The irony is devastating. Canada is the world's fourth largest gold producer, mining about 200 tons annually, yet holds none of it. The country that built its history partly on the Klondike Gold Rush now has nothing in its vault. Canada chose to depend entirely on the goodwill of other nations, rather than hold an asset with intrinsic value and no counterparty risk. While great powers were arming themselves with gold, Canada was disarming. November 2024 happened. Donald Trump won the presidential election, defeating Kamala Harris. And even before he was inaugurated in January 2025, Trump started talking about tariffs. Not small tariffs, massive ones. 25% on all products from Canada and Mexico. His reasoning? Fentanyl smuggling and illegal immigration. But Trump had been frustrated with Canada for years. He felt Canada took advantage of America in trade deals. He publicly mocked Justin Trudeau. He sensed weakness. In late November 2024, Trudeau flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump and try to smooth things over. That meeting became a disaster for Canada. Trump started calling Trudeau Governor Trudeau. He suggested Canada should just become America's 51st state. Some people laughed it off as typical Trump trolling. They shouldn't have. February 1st, 2025. Remember that date. That's the day everything fell apart. President Trump declared a national emergency and imposed 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, except energy, which got hit with a 10% tariff. The impact was immediate and severe. The Canadian stock market dropped sharply. The Canadian dollar weakened. Companies that had operated for decades suddenly faced massive cost increases on exports. Supply chains that moved seamlessly across the border for years faced disruption. Canada's GDP contracted 0.4% in the second quarter of 2025 as exports and business investment plummeted. Canada retaliated with its own tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, later expanding to $155 billion. But this was David versus Goliath. Canada needed America way more than America needed Canada. That 76% dependency wasn't just a statistic anymore. It was leverage, and Trump knew exactly how to use it. Jobs started disappearing. Manufacturing plants closed or relocated. Entire communities that relied on cross-border trade faced economic devastation. Unemployment climbed from 6.1% in early 2025 to peak at 7.1% by September, levels not seen in years. Business confidence collapsed as companies put investments on hold, and Canadians looked to their government for help, for leadership, for someone to fix this. Instead, they got Justin Trudeau at his weakest. On January 6, 2025, less than a month before the tariffs hit, Trudeau announced he was resigning. Not immediately, but after the Liberal Party elected a new leader on March 9th. So Canada faces the worst economic crisis in decades. The American president is actively hostile to Canada's interests. And Canada's prime minister is a lame duck who's already announced he's leaving. Trudeau tried to negotiate with Trump, but it was pointless. Trump had zero respect for him. Their relationship was so toxic that Trudeau's mere presence at the negotiating table hurt Canada's position. Canada needed a strong leader who could stand up to Trump, who could rally the country, who could negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, Canada had a prime minister packing his boxes while the House burned down. Trudeau later warned that Trump wanted a total collapse of the Canadian economy because that'll make it easier to annex us. But what was he doing to prevent it? Canada had no leadership at the moment it needed leadership most. Meanwhile, Trump wasn't joking about the 51st state. Frankly, Canada should be the 51st state, he told Fox News. Canada relies entirely on the United States. We don't rely on Canada. He linked tariff relief to Canada joining the United States. Just last week, on January 19, 2026, Trump posted an AI-altered image on Truth Social showing himself in the Oval Office with European leaders, including French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Starmer, gathered around a map where the American flag covers not just the United States, but Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, and Cuba. The image, manipulated from an August 2025 meeting photo, showed these territories as part of America. Minutes later, he posted another image of himself planting an American flag in Greenland labeled Greenland U.S. Territory Est 2026. No captions, just the message. At first, all Canadians were united against this. Trudeau responded saying there is not a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would be annexed. Provincial premiers stood firm. But then the economic pain kept getting worse through mid-2025. By July, Trump raised tariffs even higher, to 35% on many goods. Canadian businesses faced collapse. People lost their jobs. The economy contracted 0.4% in Q2 2025. Though Canada removed most retaliatory tariffs by late 2025 and unemployment began falling again, reaching 6.5% by November, the damage to business confidence and investment had been done. And here's where the cracks appeared. A January 2025 poll by the Angus Reid Institute found that 18% of Albertans surveyed supported Trump's annexation proposal, the highest of any province, though still a vast minority. But the real story isn't about joining America. It's about Alberta's growing separatist movement wanting independence from Canada entirely. Whether it's their own country or potentially joining the U.S. remains unclear and deeply divisive even among separatists themselves. What's clear is this: economic crisis was fracturing Canadian unity. Now we need to talk about something crucial. Canada isn't really one nation. It's a collection of provinces with very different interests, cultures, and relationships with both America and each other. Let's start with Alberta. Alberta is oil country. It's conservative, entrepreneurial, and culturally has more in common with Montana or Texas than with Toronto or Montreal. Albertans have felt ignored by the federal government for decades. They've watched Ottawa impose environmental regulations that hurt their oil industry. They've seen their equalization payments flow east while they struggle. And they've seen their biggest export market, the United States, become hostile, while their own government seems powerless to help. The Alberta separatist movement has been growing, with petitions now circulating for a referendum on independence. Some separatists want Alberta to become its own independent country. Others have discussed potentially joining the United States, though this remains controversial even among separatists themselves. What's undeniable is the frustration. Western separatism isn't new in Canada, but it's never been stronger than it is right now. The frustration isn't just about economics. It's about respect, identity, and feeling like Ottawa neither understands nor cares about them. And Trump's rhetoric, whether intentionally or not, has amplified these divisions. Then there's Quebec. Quebec has flirted with independence for over 50 years. They held referendums in 1980 and 1995. The second one nearly succeeded. The Nord side won by less than 1%. Quebec sovereigntists have always argued that Quebec would be better off as an independent nation, preserving its French language and culture. But there was always one big counter-argument: economics. Quebec's economy was deeply integrated with the rest of Canada and with the United States. But now the Canadian economy is in shambles anyway. Now the relationship with the United States is toxic regardless. So what exactly is Quebec getting by staying? The sovereigntist movement, which had been relatively quiet for years, is awakening. If Canada can't provide economic stability, and if the federal government has proven it can't protect Canadian interests, why stay in Confederation? And here's the nightmare scenario for Canada. If one province leaves, others might follow. If Alberta goes, Saskatchewan might go with them. If Quebec leaves, the country is literally split in two geographically. The Atlantic provinces would be isolated. British Columbia might decide to go its own way. What started as an economic dependency on the United States has now become an existential crisis about whether Canada as a unified country even makes sense anymore. On March 14th, 2025, Mark Carney was sworn in as Canada's new Prime Minister. Finally, after months of chaos, Canada had a leader. And not just any leader. Carney was the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He understood economics. He had international credibility. He was respected by world leaders. Maybe, just maybe, he could fix this. Carney immediately started trying to negotiate with Trump. In May, they met, and it seemed cordial. Carney told Trump it wasn't useful to keep threatening annexation. Trump actually praised Carney, calling him a big step up from Trudeau. But the tariffs stayed, the economic pain continued, and Trump kept playing games. By October 2025, Trump terminated all trade negotiations with Canada completely. Why? Because Ontario ran an advertisement during the World Series criticizing his tariffs. Trump called it interference in American politics and walked away from the table entirely. Carney realized something fundamental. Trump wasn't negotiating in good faith. He was using economic warfare to try to force Canada's submission. The old relationship, built on trust, cooperation, and mutual benefit, was dead. So Carney made a declaration that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The old relationship we had with the U.S., based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. He announced Canada would double its non-U.S. exports over the next decade. Canada would diversify. Canada would become independent economically. But here's the brutal question. Is it too late? As of January 2026, Canada faces profound uncertainty. The economy showed unexpected resilience in late 2025. Unemployment fell back to 6.8%. GDP grew 0.6% in Q3, and some employment recovered. But the damage runs deeper than quarterly statistics. Investment has been postponed or canceled. Companies are reconsidering their Canadian operations. And here's the core problem that remains. That 76% dependency is not just an economic vulnerability. It's a national security threat. When 3/4 of your exports flow to one destination, you don't have trade policy. You have hostage situation. The leadership crisis deepens across Canada. 13 days ago, on January 14th, Quebec Premier François Legault resigned after 7 years in power, his popularity in collapse. The latest poll showed his party at just 10% support, with over 50% of Quebecers viewing him very unfavorably. Ministers resigned over failed healthcare reforms. The Northvolt battery disaster cost Quebec $270 million and 0 jobs. The SACLIC app wasted over $1 billion and still doesn't work. Legault admitted there were a few failures, but it was too little, too late. Now the separatist Parti Québécois leads the polls by a massive margin, promising a referendum on independence. The Quebec sovereigntist movement, dormant for years, is roaring back to life. If they win the October election, Canada faces its most serious existential threat since 1995. Meanwhile, Trump continues tightening the noose. On January 16th, Mark Carney made his first official visit to China as Prime Minister, reaching a landmark agreement with President Xi Jinping. Canada would allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the market annually at a lowered tariff rate of 6.1%, growing to 70,000 over 5 years. In exchange, China would slash duties on Canadian agricultural exports, canola seed tariffs dropping from 85% to 15%, and removing anti-discrimination tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas. The deal would unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian workers. It wasn't a free trade deal, just fixing problems from recent trade disputes. But Trump saw an opportunity. When journalists asked about Canada's China deal, Trump exploded on social media. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. Then came the hammer. Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if the China deal proceeded. Think about what just happened. Canada tried to reduce its dependence on America by diversifying trade partners. And America's response was, no, you don't get to have other customers. You belong to me. On Sunday, January 26, Carney immediately backed down, clarifying Canada had no intention of pursuing free trade with China. He had no choice. 100% tariff would be economic annihilation. This is the trap Canada has built for itself. There's an old French business saying, le client est roi, the customer is king. But Trump has inverted it. He's saying, I'm not your customer, I'm your king. And I decide if you eat or starve. Canada now faces an impossible choice between two types of pain. Option 1, temporary devastation. Try to diversify away from America, face punishing tariffs in the short term, hope to build alternative trade relationships over 10 or 15 years. But America won't let them do it for free. Trump has made that crystal clear. Option 2, permanent vulnerability. Stay at 75% dependency, accept whatever terms America demands, surrender all leverage forever, and live under constant threat of economic warfare whenever a U.S. president decides to apply pressure. There is no good option. That's what happens when you put yourself on the menu. Provinces are at each other's throats. Alberta feels abandoned. Quebec sees an opening for independence. Ontario is bleeding investment. The Atlantic provinces fear being forgotten entirely. British Columbia is trying to stay neutral but getting dragged into the chaos. And through all of this, Canadians are asking themselves painful questions. Can Canada survive without America? Should it even try? Was Confederation a mistake? Would we be better off apart? These aren't fringe questions anymore. These are mainstream conversations happening in coffee shops, living rooms, and provincial legislatures across the country. So what can we learn from Canada's crisis? Economic dependency is economic vulnerability. Canada built its entire economy around one customer. When that customer turned hostile, Canada had no backup plan, no diversification, no leverage. Countries, like businesses, need multiple revenue streams. Leadership matters, especially in a crisis. Trudeau's failure to provide strong leadership during the critical early months of this crisis made everything worse. He was a lame duck when Canada needed a lion. He was ineffective when Canada needed decisive action. Leadership vacuums don't stay empty. They fill with chaos. National unity requires more than shared borders. Canada's crisis exposed how fragile Canadian unity really is. When times are good, differences can be papered over. But when times are bad, those differences become fractures, and fractures become breaks. A nation needs more than economic convenience to hold it together. It needs shared purpose, mutual respect, and a sense that everyone is in it together. Once lost, trust is almost impossible to rebuild. For 150 years, Canada and the United States built trust. In less than a year, that trust was shattered, and rebuilding it could take decades, if it's even possible at all. Now, let me say something that might be controversial but needs to be said. This is not about whether Trump is right or wrong, fair or unfair. In geopolitics, fairness doesn't matter. Power matters. Leverage matters. Canada gave all its leverage away. When Carney stood in Davos and said, "If we're not at the table, we're on the menu," he was describing the brutal reality of international relations. But Canada didn't just fail to get a seat at the table. Canada chose to make itself completely dependent on one country, sold all its gold, failed to build housing despite being the second largest country on earth, allowed its leadership to become ineffective, and ignored every warning sign for decades. Trump didn't create Canada's vulnerability. He's exploiting it, and that's what great powers do. They find weakness and exploit it. China does it, Russia does it, the United States does it. This is how the world works. Carney quoted Thucydides in his Davos speech, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." That's not a moral statement, that's reality. Canada made itself weak through its own decisions. So where does Canada go from here? Mark Carney is trying to chart a new path, one that makes Canada less dependent on the United States, more connected to the world, more economically diversified. It's the right strategy, but it takes time. And time is something Canada might not have. If the economic crisis continues, if unemployment keeps rising, if provinces keep feeling abandoned by Ottawa, the calls for independence will only grow louder. Alberta might hold a referendum. Quebec might revive its sovereigntist movement. And if one province leaves, the domino effect could tear Canada apart. On the other hand, maybe this crisis becomes Canada's wake-up call. Maybe provinces realize that they're stronger together. Maybe Carney's leadership and new economic strategy work. Maybe Canada emerges from this more unified, more independent, and more resilient. But that's the optimistic scenario. And right now, optimism is in short supply. Canada's crisis is a warning to every nation. Don't build your entire future on someone else is goodwill. For decades, Canada made a bet. It bet that the United States would always be a reliable partner. It bet that economic integration would guarantee prosperity. It bet that the friendship would last forever. And it was wrong. Now Canada is paying the price. Provinces are considering independence. The economy is in crisis. The relationship with America is broken. And the future is uncertain. This is what happens when you surrender leverage. This is what happens when leadership fails at the critical moment. This is what happens when you confuse economic convenience with national strength. This is what happens when you've put yourself on the menu. Canada's story isn't over yet, but the ending is no longer certain. The question now is, will Canada survive this crisis as one nation? Or will this be the beginning of the end of the Canadian experiment? Canada didn't lose a war, it lost leverage. And in geopolitics, that's the same thing. This is Econ Empires. Thanks for watching. Comment, and I'll see you in the next one.